My grandpa, Cyrus Foley, was a church-going man. When he was still in his teens, he served in France with the Marine Corps during World War I, fighting hand-to-hand with German soldiers among the trees and trenches of a land he could barely even point to on a map. He was just a boy when he sailed off to France, but he returned a man, and one who'd continue his life of service by joining the Haywood County Sheriff's Department here in western North Carolina. He said he saw the very worst of humanity out there in the mud, the blood, and the barbed wire. He said he saw the devil, too. He saw him when the bravest soul he'd ever known ran out into no man's land to drag a wounded comrade to the safety of a shell crater, only to witness both men blown apart when that very same shell hole suffered another direct hit by German artillery. He also saw him whispering into the ears of good-hearted church-going country boys who started to enjoy the killing just a little too much. He said that's when he realized there truly were these competing forces of good and evil in the world, and that both, not one or the other, plant their seeds in a man's mind. The man doesn't get a choice in that, but what he does get to choose is which one he waters every day. Water that good seed and great things can happen. Water the bad one, and, well, you get the idea. And that's why he went to church every Sunday, to water that seed of good, so it kept on growing and kept on bearing good fruit. Some weeks he'd stay for Sunday service and then head home with everyone else. Others he'd spend many a long hour sitting in the pews, eyes closed with his hands clasped in prayer, trying to figure out how in the world folks could be so damned rotten to one another. One time I was staying over at his place while Mom and Dad were having one of their fights, and he was telling me stories about his time as a deputy. He had stories that'd make you laugh till your sides hurt, and he had some real tear-jerkers too. But then this one time, I asked Grandpa to tell me about some of the spookier or scarier things he'd seen as a deputy. I was older then, maybe 14 or 15, and being a grandson, I guess he didn't bother holding back on all the details. Because by the time he finished with this story, I just about had to kneel down to pick my jaw up off the floor. Grandpa Cy said back in late October of 1923, he went to bed one Sunday night feeling light as a feather. It had been a quiet week, the weekend weather had been nice but dry, and he'd eaten a Sunday dinner fit for a king cooked by his new wife and my future grandma. As he drifted off to sleep, all felt right with the world. But when he woke up, he found himself in the middle of a crap storm of biblical proportions. So, Grandpa woke up at 5:30 in the morning, took a shower, and had some breakfast, and then drove over to the sheriff's office in Waynesville in the old, beaten-up Model T the department gave him. He opens the place up for 7 a.m. sharp. Then he sat behind the front desk drinking his second cup of coffee when a man from a little town called Woodrow comes stumbling through the door, having walked all the way down the 276 in his stockinged feet. Grandpa Cy said he could tell the man was drunk before he even opened his mouth, but he looked worse than drunk, because his big bloodshot eyes had this wide, frightened look about them, like they'd seen something awful. The man staggers up to the front desk and tells Grandpa Cy that he needs to lock him up. Then when my grandpa asks why, the man gets very agitated and begs to be locked up or shot, because he's just murdered his wife and infant daughter. Now, my grandpa didn't know this man from Adam, and people say all kinds of crazy stuff when they're drunk, but that man sure looked like he'd done something awful. So without putting any cuffs on him and without even locking the door, Grandpa Cy sits the man down in a cell, then calls the sheriff to let him know what he's heard. A few hours later, my Grandpa Cy joined the sheriff and a handful of deputies in driving over to Woodrow to verify the man's claims. He might have been drunker than a possum in a moonshine jug, as they say, when he walked into that office, but the man was no liar. He'd hacked his wife and infant daughter to pieces as they slept in each other's arms. The axe he used was lying just a few feet away. Grandpa said that you couldn't tell where mother ended and baby began. The sheriff and Grandpa Cy then drove back to the office, and after sitting down with the murderers, they asked him why he did it. With the worst hangover of his entire life kicking in, and having not slept for all of 24 hours, the guy wasn't exactly lucid. But what he said commanded my grandpa's full and undivided attention. About 2 months before he hacked up his wife and daughter, the murderer, a man named Lenny McLean, was walking home from his job at a sawmill when he met a woman by the roadside. She called herself Lily Beth, and she was the most beautiful young woman McLean had ever seen. That first occasion, McLean and Lily Beth simply swapped smiles as they passed one another. But then the second day, they got to talking, and the same could be said for the third and fourth and the fifth, and so on. And by the time the weekend came, McLean couldn't keep his mind off of Lily Beth, and he wanted nothing more than to get back to work on Monday so he could walk and talk with her again. This carries on for about a month or two, with McLean saying Lily Beth seemed to know him better than he knew himself. She said things that made him feel like he was walking on air, things that made him think everything in life was going to be just fine, and that the only two people that mattered in the world were him and her. McLean said he realized that he was in love with her early on, but the more they walked and talked, the giddier and more lovesick he'd get when he was and wasn't around her. He said he tried to keep a hold of himself, that he knew it was wrong, but one day it just spilled out of him like a river breaking through a beaver dam. He told Lily Beth that he loved her with all of his heart and soul, and that he wanted nothing more than to be with her for the rest of his life. But seeing as Lily Beth knew McLean was a married man, she told him that was impossible. The idea of simply abandoning both his wife and infant child was unthinkable, as with no means of providing for themselves, they'd either starve or end up in some kind of poorhouse, and back then, those places were riddled with all kinds of diseases and parasites, certainly no place for a single woman and her newborn. No, if Lenny McLean and Lily Beth were going to run away together, there was something that she insisted he do first, and that was to send his wife and newborn daughter to heaven. Lily Beth asked if they were free of sin, and when McLean told her they were, she said there'd be no better parting gift than paradise for all eternity. He said that at the time, it all made perfect sense to him, and that he thought of it like being a surgeon. He had to do something brief, bloody, and ugly, but it was something that would benefit all parties in the long term, especially his wife and baby girl, who would no doubt forgive him once they understood, and they would understand, because everyone was going to understand once they heard the full story. He said it was like being drunk without whiskey, that Lily Beth twisted his mind until the thing that shouldn't have made sense seemed like the cleverest concept ever conceived. So that night, after arranging a place he'd meet Lily Beth after sending his wife and daughter to live with the Lord, Lenny took an axe from the woodshed around the back of his house, waited till they were asleep, then hacked them to pieces. When he was done, McLean washed the blood off himself and changed his clothes, then ran off into the woods to meet Lily Beth at their prearranged meeting place. He's running through the trees, thinking about how happy he's going to be with the memory of his family's hacked-up bodies becoming an ever more distant memory for him. But when he gets to the romantic rendezvous, right when he was supposed to, Lily Beth is nowhere to be found. McLean doesn't just go wandering off, though. He waits there for 1 hour, then 2 hours, calling out her name and wandering around. But then, just as the sun's starting to come up, he sees it. A little wooden statue no bigger than a child's doll, and it's sitting right there in the center of their meeting place. He said he walked over, picked it up, then when he saw it bore a strange resemblance to Lily Beth, he realized he'd been stood up in quite spectacular fashion. He didn't want to believe it at first. I guess no one would. But as he walked back towards the crime scene that had once been his home, reality took a bite out of him. He sat on his kitchen table, drank every drop of illegal home-brewed liquor he had stashed away, and this was back in Prohibition times, and then walked all the way into Waynesville to confess to his crimes. Once he was done talking, the sheriff told McLean he was officially under arrest, which naturally confused the man because he thought he already was. After that, he slept for just shy of 24 hours, On and off, of course, accounting for the nightmares. And every couple of hours, McLean would wake up screaming, and then would only drift off back to sleep once he was done wailing his apologies to a wife and daughter who couldn't hear him. It was terrible, an unthinkable thing he'd done that previous night, but he wasn't the only one to commit a heinous act around that same time. Just after midday, one of the Haywood County deputies comes running into the office saying there's been a triple murder down in Willits. There was a little house on Cantor Lane that was home to the Browning family, consisting of William, his wife, and their 2 sons. Well, one of the Brownings' neighbors decided to stop by to check on them, as they hadn't seen hide nor hair of the Brownings all morning, and their 2 boys hadn't shown up to the local schoolhouse. She walks over to the property, then pushes her way past the front door, only to find herself greeted by a scene from a nightmare. Lying around the kitchen table in various states of mutilation were the bodies of William Browning's wife and 2 sons, all blown apart by buckshot. Deputies then stopped by Will Browning's place of work, the Metzger Electric Company, only to find that he hadn't shown up that day. Then they searched the area surrounding his home, including a little place known as Moonshine Creek, and that's where they found him. Browning's body was blue, his eyes were open and bloodshot, and there was a thick stream of dried vomit running down his shirt. One hand still held onto the handle of the moonshine jug he'd filled his belly with, and in the other was a little wooden statue, no bigger than a child's doll. Grandpa Cy said the sheriff and his fellow deputies were already stretched thin at this point. They had a couple of boys out in Woodrow watching over the McLean house, and then a couple of more down in Willits watching over the Browning house. Everyone knew they had one hell of a week coming up, and that they'd be busy from dawn till dusk working the investigations. But little did they know, they had 2 more bodies just waiting to be found. A fisherman out near Lake Junaluska was walking along the shore near where the Turnville Bridge is today when he saw something bobbing up and down near the water's edge. He got a little closer, then realized what he was looking at. It was a body, and he didn't realize it at the time, but it was the corpse of one of his son's closest friends, a boy named Arlo McElmore. Within the hour, 2 deputies had been delegated to stand guard over the scene while they tried to figure out what had happened, and the only thing that made sense was young Arlo having taken a tumble from the bridge while he was either drunk or exhausted. There was always the chance he'd been pushed, of course, so one of the deputies went up onto the bridge to look for signs of a struggle. He found something all right, but it wasn't any evidence of a fight or an attack. Sitting there, on one of the thick wooden guardrails, was a little wooden statue, just like the one found by McLean and the one in the hand of old Will Browning, who'd gunned down his family, then filled his belly with bad moonshine. In the weeks that followed, the Haywood County Sheriff's Department, Grandpa Cy included, worked tirelessly to try and piece together the events surrounding each grouping of murders. Arlo wasn't married, so assuming the presence of the little wooden statue meant that he too had taken a life before ending his own, folks started to wonder just who the unlucky party had been. But when they searched his residence, there was no wandering anymore. Arlo's sister, Mariana McElmore, was lying in her brother's bed. Arlo had killed her, gutted her, and was halfway to skinning her corpse before he decided to just stop and walk out to Lake Junaluska. Then, whatever happened at that bridge, Arlo took a tumble off it and ended up breaking his neck. The deputies worked those cases for months, with barely any rest at all, until they finally came to the conclusion that there was nothing that could be done. Lenny McLean helped as best as he was able, told them everything he could about Lily Beth, until, of course, he realized he knew next to nothing about her. Somehow, they had been talking for months almost daily, and he didn't know where she was from, the name of her family, or where she lived around the time of the murders. Deputies then went door to door all over the country, asking folks if they knew anyone fitting Lily Beth's description of a red-haired beauty with piercing green eyes. The sheriff didn't think it'd be long before they found someone who remembered seeing a girl like that. But he was wrong. The only person in the whole of Haywood County that seemed aware of Lily Beth's existence was Lenny McLean, or at least, The only man living, of course. The idea that this mysterious Lilybeth had talked to not one, but 3 different men into murdering their families was next to impossible. But considering they all happened on the same night, and that each man ran into one of those strange wooden statues, it was clear to all that each crime was connected in some way. Grandpa Cy said that the sheriff figured that it had to be a group of women, all working on a different man on a long con that ended in slaughter. But that left everyone asking, what was the con? Nothing appeared to be stolen from any of the crime scenes, while Lenny McLean himself said Lilybeth hadn't asked him for a single red cent, not even one time. All these women seemed interested in, if in fact it was a group and not an individual, was talking Macklemore, Browning, and McLean into murdering their loved ones, because after that, they disappeared with only a single trace of them left behind, those little wooden statues. Now naturally, the sheriff and his boys were very interested in catching up with the mysterious Lilybeth, but the district judge didn't give a good goddamn who she was. Lenny McLean swore on the Holy Bible that he and he alone had taken the lives of his wife and infant daughter, so the judge decided that he and he alone would sit in the electric chair. McLean's attorney, his family, hell, even the sheriff all thought he could have qualified for an insanity defense, but since he never sought to do anything but confess to what he'd done, the judge had no choice but to hand down the only punishment that fit, the death penalty. But McLean didn't mind, and he wanted to die. Then after many years sitting on death row, he got his wish. No one at the Haywood County Sheriff's Department ever did find anyone named Lilybeth living in the area, nor did they find anyone quite fitting her description either. And so naturally, it became something of a legend among sheriffs and deputies both past and present. Then one day, my grandpa Cy is up visiting an old-timer who used to be sheriff back when he was a boy, and he's talking to him about the 3 family murders that happened back in October of 1923. This old sheriff wanted to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, start to finish, kind of like what I've done here. And then while he's telling the story, Grandpa Cyrus reaches into his pocket and pulls out one of those little wooden statues. Since they had the other 2 locked up in evidence, he figured it wouldn't do any harm to take one for a wander, especially if it was wrapped up in a piece of cloth so no one could leave the fingerprints on it. But then, when he handed the old sheriff the little wooden doll, and that old-timer unwrapped the cloth, he studied it for a moment before his face dropped. Grandpa Cy said the old sheriff looked up at him, ashen-faced, and then asked him to repeat the names of the men who'd murdered their families. Grandpa told him all 3 names. Then the old-timer asked if he knew the maiden name of McLean's mother. Grandpa had talked to members of his mother's family in the aftermath of the murders, but he couldn't remember their family name. That's when the old-timer asked him, "Was it McRae?" Grandpa nodded. It had been McRae. And then when he asked the old-timer how he knew that, this is what he said. But when the old sheriff was just starting out as deputy, so way back in the 1890s, he helped investigate the murder of a spinster who lived out in the sticks. The woman, who couldn't have been any older than 40, had been in Waynesville selling bunches of flowers she picked. And then when she had enough money, she bought a bottle of whiskey from the town's general store and then drank it while wandering back home on foot. Next morning, someone found her near the dirt track that led to her home. She'd been stripped, robbed of her dignity and purity, and then shot through the eye. Seeing as he was still a deputy, the old sheriff was charged with going from door to door to see if he could find any witnesses, and then after almost 3 days of knocking on doors and getting no luck, he found someone who'd spotted something on the evening of the spinster's murder. 3 Waynesville men, all in their 20s and 30s, had been seen talking with a liquored-up spinster as she was walking out of town. The witness was able to name at least 2 of the men, while the 3rd was identified by association. All 3 men were then rounded up for questioning, and for a while, it was looking like each one would be convicted and hanged. But by some unforeseen technicality, not one of them ever spent a single night inside a jail cell for what all were convinced they were guilty of. It was a terrible miscarriage of justice, so bad that each of the accused had to move their family out of Waynesville for fear of some reprisal. The sheriff then turned to my Grandpa Cyrus and asked if he could guess the family names of those men accused. Grandpa Cy said that he didn't need a second guess, and when he said Browning, Macklemore, and McRae, the old-timer just nodded. Those men moved their families out of Waynesville out of fear of reprisal, but when it came, it wasn't visited on them. It was visited on their grandsons. Grandpa Cy then asked what it was about the little wooden doll that had brought all that back to him, because it was clear to him that that was the case from the change in the old-timer's expression. The old sheriff held the doll up to him, then pointed towards something Grandpa and his fellow deputies had always wondered about. One of its eyes was large and round, the other a small, crudely worn pit. Grandpa always figured the dolls were supposed to be some kind of message, but he could never figure out what. Yet after that visit to the old sheriff, the message became clear. The dolls were the spinster, and this was her revenge. In light of that, everyone over at the Haywood Sheriff's Department figured Lily Beth had to be one of the spinster's distant descendants, the granddaughter of a brother or sister she rarely saw that no one ever knew about. No one showed up to collect her body, and the only mourners at the spinster's funeral were folks from around Waynesville who'd heard her story. But that didn't mean she didn't have family. Family who'd eventually learn of her murder and the miscarriage of justice that followed, then want to take revenge in the only way possible. This story's from way back before the Civil War, and straight from the hills of Vergy, and although I've heard it more times than I can count, I'll be damned if it isn't a good one. You see, it's a tale about pride and wickedness, about beauty and goodness, and how sometimes the good Lord steps in when the devil gets too bold. So gather round your phones or computers, or however y'all are listening, 'cause this here's the tale of Isaac, the plantation owner's son, and Emmylou, the prettiest girl in all of Highland County. Highland County is tucked deep in the heart of what you might call Central Appalachia, a place where the sun paints the hills gold in the morning time and where the moon seems to hang low over the hollers at night. Folks lived simple back then, plowing their fields, tending to their livestock, and leaning on each other when times got tough. But even during the best of times, there was a shadow hanging over them. The grand plantation and its wealthy owner, with his fields stretched wide behind it, worked by the slaves he owned. It was perched high on a ridge like a king looking down on his subjects. Down in the valley, though, lived humbler folks, including the family of Emmylou, a girl so lovely that she could hush a room just by stepping into it. Now, the plantation owner had a boy named Isaac, a tall, strapping young feller with dark hair and a smile that might just fool you if you didn't look too close. He was handsome, sure enough, but his heart was colder than a January frost. Growing up with silver spoons and fine horses, Isaac had never heard the word no without stomping his foot. As a youngin', he'd chase the other kids with sticks, stealing their marbles or apples just to watch them cry. Then as he got older, it got worse. He'd swipe goods from the market or general store, knowing his daddy would pay off the trouble, while folks whispered about the dark things he'd done to the slaves on the plantation, things too ugly to speak plain. Then there was Emmylou. She was a sight, hair like spun gold falling in waves down her back, and eyes bluer than the sky after a rain. But it weren't just her looks that made folks fall in love with her. It was her heart. Emmylou had one as big as the mountains, always lending a hand where it was needed. She had a voice was sweet as birdsong, and she'd hum hymns while working, making you feel like all was right with the world. She'd tote baskets of bread to the hungry, stitch up torn breeches for the poor, and sit by the bedside of the sick till they mended. Her folks lived in a little cabin near a meadow, and it's there that this tale takes a dark and dreadful turn. One day, Isaac took a notion he wanted Emmylou for his own. So he dressed in his best coat, he proudly rode his black horse down to her cabin. He found Emmylou on the porch, mending a quilt when he swaggered up. He wished her good morning, tipping his hat with that sly grin of his, and then after telling her she was the prettiest girl in the whole county, he asked her for her hand in marriage. Emmy Lou looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch, and said she had no idea she felt that way. Isaac confirmed so, then added that not only would every girl for miles around kill to be in her shoes, but saying yes would guarantee her a life of luxury up in that big plantation house. But Emmy Lou wasn't swayed by fancy words or promises. She set her quilt down and met his eyes square, then told him that while she was flattered, she didn't love him, and she couldn't marry a man she didn't love. Isaac's face went red as a rooster's comb. He repeated how he was the son of the richest man in Highland County, and that she was throwing away a life most would beg for. Emmy Lou said maybe that was so, but she still wouldn't wed for less than true love. That just about done it. Isaac reared up like a bear stung by a bee, hollering about how she'd lived to regret turning him down. Then he stormed off, leaving nothing but fury and scattered chickens behind him. Isaac wasn't the kind to let a slight go unanswered. He brooded up in that big old plantation house, his anger festering like a sore. Then over the next days that followed, he hatched a plan blacker than coal. He knew Emmy Lou loved picking flowers in the meadows near her cabin, a peaceful spot hemmed in by trees with wildflowers of every color. She'd go there near every day, basket swinging as she sang to herself, and that's where Isaac decided he'd get her. He'd sneak up on her, take her by force, and then slit her throat to hush her up. Then, to cover his tracks, he'd leave a few strands of cotton staple on her body, pointing the blame at one of his daddy's slaves. It was a devil's scheme, born of pure spite and poisonous pride, and young Isaac intended to follow through with it. So, one sunny morning, Emmy Lou set out for the meadow with her empty basket, ready to be filled with flowers. But what she didn't know was that Isaac was watching up on the ridge with a heart all filled up with hate. Then once she was out of sight, he slipped down all quiet, keeping his distance as he tailed Emmy Lou towards the meadows. Since the weather was looking good that morning, the meadows must have made for quite a picture. Bees buzzing, birds chirping, and Emmy Lou's singing floating on the breeze. I picture her wandering among the blooms, picking daisies and black-eyed Susans with gentle fingers before tucking them into her basket. But then there was Isaac, crouched low, waiting for the right moment as he stalked her from the tree line. But just as he tensed to spring, the sky above them turned gray. Then, from what must have seemed like out of nowhere, a dark cloud passed over them, and a low rumble growled through the hollow. It was a flash thunderstorm, the kind that sweeps in fast and fierce. The wind picked up, whipping the grass as lightning split the sky. Then when the thunder boomed, shaking the ground, Emmy Lou glanced up with worry. She knew those storms. All of us do round these parts, how they drench you to the bone if you don't take cover. So quick as a flash, she gathered her flowers and ran for home while Isaac cursed under his breath. He'd waited patiently, and now the storm was stealing his chance. He vowed to get Emmy Lou another day, but fate had other plans. Come morning time, the storm had come and gone, leaving the air cool and the ground slick. Then out near the meadow, a peddler was trudging along the road when he spied something odd lying by the wayside. At first he reckoned it was a fallen log or maybe a dead critter, but as he drew near, his stomach turned over. It was Isaac, or at least, what was left of him. His body was blackened and twisted, his clothes burned clean off, and the stink of charred flesh hung so heavy in the air that it was enough to sour a dead man's ale. Lightning had struck him dead. The peddler crossed himself as he muttered a prayer, then hightailed it to the nearest farm to spread the word. Word spread through the county faster than a greyhound on the hunt. Folks gathered in the town square, buzzing like bees about the news of Isaac's death. Some folks said they always knew he'd meet a bad end, that he was rotten to the core. Others said it was a guardian angel looking out for Emmy Lou, as word of Isaac's intent to wed her had spread through town. Emmy Lou herself stayed hush, Some said that there was relief in her eyes, but also a touch of sorrow. She'd been spared, but it was a heavy thing for a soul like hers to bear. Before long, life settled back to its regular rhythm, but Isaac and Emmylou's tale grew roots. Folks would tell it around the fire, pass it down like an heirloom, and use it to scare their kids into good behavior. Mind Isaac, they'd say, who thought he could take what he pleased, but the Lord sent a bolt from the blue to set things right. Emmylou lived a long and happy life, marrying a good man who loved her true, and she bore sons who bore their father's strength, but also carried her kindness too. She moved on, but she never forgot that day in the meadow, and some say she believed to her last breath that a higher power had stepped in to save her. So there's your story, straight from those old hills of Appalachia. Pride and cruelty will lead you to ruin, but goodness and faith will always see you through. The Lord's watching, and sometimes His justice can be as swift as lightning. On January 18th of the year 1970, two freshmen from West Virginia University decided to hitchhike back to their dorms after catching a showing of Oliver in central Morgantown. During the movie's intermission, Merritt Malarick and Karen Farrell bumped into two fellow WVU students, Paulette Burns and her boyfriend, Clarence Lewis. The group chatted in the movie theater's lobby while buying snacks, then sat together for the remainder of the showing. Following the film's conclusion, the four students walked in the direction of Willie Street, but upon spotting a cream-colored sedan driving down the street towards them, either Merritt or Karen stuck out their thumb. The sedan stopped. Then Paulette and her boyfriend watched as the two girls climbed into the car's three-seater frontal compartment. They thought they'd see the two girls back at the campus dorms, but neither Merritt nor Karen would ever be seen alive again. Paulette Burns might have been a college freshman, but she was not naive. She knew hitchhiking came with an inherent risk, so when she arrived back at the WVU dorms and discovered neither Merritt nor Karen were anywhere to be found, she started to grow concerned. She asked around the dorms, checked the girls' rooms again, and then after another hour or so passed, she contacted law enforcement to report the two girls missing. Paulette was convinced something was wrong, but the officers down at the Morgantown Police Department didn't quite share her sense of urgency. The two girls had only been gone a matter of hours, and while Paulette's concern was touching, it was perhaps a little premature. The officers down at the department knew college kids, especially those situated near the Appalachian Trail, were prone to bouts of spontaneous adventure, and in all likelihood, Merritt and Karen would return to their dorms within 24 to 48 hours. But they were sadly and painfully wrong. After a few days went by and the girls had yet to reappear at their WVU dormitory, Paulette called the police again. Only then did they act on her report. Officers reached out to the girls' dorm mates and parents to gather information on them before issuing a public appeal for information regarding their whereabouts. Photographs of the two girls were released, along with details of their last known sightings, but frustratingly, nobody came forward. 6 long weeks went by before the first break in the case, but when it came, it didn't bode well for the missing girls' safety. Because when a kid was walking along the US 119 picking up trash as part of a cleanup program, he found Merritt's purse lying among the foliage. A few weeks later, on April 8th of 1970, the West Virginia State Police received an anonymous letter postmarked in Cumberland, Maryland, just 2 days prior. It read as follows: "Gentlemen, I have some information on the whereabouts of the bodies of the two missing West Virginia University co-eds, Merritt Malarick and Karen Farrell. Follow directions very carefully to the nth degree and you cannot fail to find them. Proceed 25 miles directly south from the southern line of Morgantown. This will bring you to a wooded forest land. Enter into the forest exactly 1 mile. There are the bodies. 25 plus 1 equals 26 miles total. Will reveal myself when the bodies are located. The letter was signed with nothing but a crudely drawn triangle. Just a few days later, while the police were still investigating the anonymous letter, they received a second. Many believe it was prompted by the publishing of the first letter in a local newspaper, and just like the initial correspondence, it was postmarked in Maryland and signed with nothing but a triangle. "Gentlemen," it read, "I saw the article in this morning's newspaper concerning my previous letter on the missing two co-eds. If you reread my first letter carefully, you will see the directions were specific, directly south from the city, meaning the southern limit of Morgantown, West Virginia. Straight south 25 miles, you will come to a forest woodland. Enter in 1 mile south. Fanning out, you will locate the bodies of the girls covered over with brush. Look carefully. The animals are now on the move. Do trust this will help you out with exact location. Will still identify myself when bodies are located. Sincerely, Triangle." Once the public was made aware of the letter's contents, widespread outcry prompted West Virginia's governor to order a search based on the directions they contained. This search yielded items such as Merritt's sunglasses, along with Karen's purse and driver's license, which were found scattered between 50 and 75 meters off the road. This suggested someone had purposefully left them there in the hopes that they wouldn't be found, as opposed to simply tossing them from a car window. Obviously, law enforcement found the letter's mention of the girls' bodies to be extremely discouraging. But just 2 days following the governor's mandated search, their worst fears were confirmed. On April 16th, the bodies of Merritt Malarick and Karen Farrell were found 11 miles south of Morgantown, not the 26 as stated in the letters. Both had been decapitated. The girls' bodies had been placed on top of each other. The body on the bottom was face up and the body on the top was face down, while both wore the same clothes they were wearing when they vanished. They were also covered with flat rocks thought to have been brought over from a nearby creek bed. These rocks have since been described as having the appearance of tombstones. There was also a fallen tree on top of the bodies, but it was unclear whether its placement had been purposeful. Due to the advanced state of decomposition in which the remains were found, it was impossible to determine if the girls had been violated prior to death. However, since their clothes appeared untampered with, a pack of cigarettes tucked into the waistband of Merritt's jeans was still there, this was deemed improbable. However, not only were the girls' severed heads missing, the necklaces each girl had been wearing at the time of their abduction was also unaccounted for, as well as either a fur hat or fur gloves that one of them had been wearing. In the days that followed, 2 more letters signed only with triangles were dispatched. One went to the West Virginia State Police, the other was addressed to the parents of the late Merritt Malarick. Each gave directions to the location of the girls' severed heads. A third letter, dated April 21st, was sent to Morgantown Police. It read as follows: "The heads can be found from the position of the bodies by striking out 10 degrees southwest for the first head, and approximately 10 degrees southeast for the second, roughly 1 mile. You are already 7/10 of that mile. They are within the mine entrance, if you can call it an entrance considering its condition. They are buried not over 1 foot in depth. The ones responsible for the murders scattered some of the girls' personal effects over the general area, creating a pattern of confusion, making it difficult for you to pinpoint any exact location. My first 2 letters triggered your intensive search. Don't give up now. Sincerely, Triangle." A final letter was dated April 28th and was sent to Merritt's parents. "I have sent 3 letters to the Morgantown State Police Department concerning your daughter Merritt. The first and second were taken with some seriousness and instituted a search which was successful in locating 2 bodies minus the heads which were needed for other purposes. All of a sudden the police have been complaining about an error in the mileage stated in my second letter. After one has driven in an oval pattern for 26 miles under the weather condition of January and under the involved circumstances, it is impossible to make about an 18-mile error in the precise location of the bodies. Nevertheless, They were found south of Morgantown as stated in the letter, even to that which was called a logging lane or old mine road, in my opinion both the same. Police believed the author of the Triangle letters was their primary suspect in the murders of Merritt and Karen, and it's clear that the early stages of the investigation were centered around this theory. However, following it through analysis of one of the letters, police were able to trace the letters back to 3 members of a small religious cult known as the Psychic Science Church. When they confronted the movement's leader, Reverend Richard Hoover, he claimed the ability to convene with spirits from another realm and that the information in the letters had been provided by these same spirits. Officers were stunned. Not only were the letters little more than a distasteful hoax, but the author offered no apologies for them whatsoever. After the identity of the Triangle letters' author was discovered, and the Psychic Science Church was cleared of any involvement in the girls' murders, the investigation slowed to a crawl. But then years later, in 1976, a man named Eugene Clausen shocked the nation by confessing to the murders. Clausen had lived in the nearby town of Point Marion for most of his life. He was also convicted of abusing children and, at the time of his confession, was residing in a New Jersey prison for related offenses. When he first contacted the West Virginia State Police, he claimed that he was having nightmares based on his memories of the murders. Then, following a lengthy interview, he wrote a 35-page confession after passing a polygraph test. However, it was during this polygraph test that Clausen displayed a complete lack of knowledge regarding the intimate details of the case. Then, in his confession letter, he made a number of incorrect statements, such as claiming he'd laid the girls' lifeless bodies side by side, or that he forced them into the backseat of his car rather than the front, as confirmed by Paulette Burns. There was also another significant problem with Clausen's confession. He claimed to have violated both girls at least 4 to 6 times each, yet it was soon discovered that Clausen suffered a condition known as Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal abnormality resulting in an XXY genome rather than the regular XY. Klinefelter syndrome results in severe genital dysfunction, with medical professionals claiming that Clausen's condition was so acute that it would be physically impossible for him to violate anyone just once, let alone consecutively. Yet just when it seems like Clausen's claims were of no importance, one of his assertions actually advanced the investigation. When asked where he'd disposed of the girls' severed heads, Clausen claimed he'd thrown them into a crevice at an old schoolyard. Police performed a thorough search, only to discover that Clausen was once again fabricating information. However, after analyzing a bird's nest in the area, police found human hairs which were a visual match for that of Karen and Merritt. These hairs had no roots attached, leading investigators to believe they were cut and not pulled from the heads of the victims. Someone hadn't just cut the girls' heads off, they'd given them a haircut too. Clausen was officially charged with the murders of Merritt Malarick and Karen Farrell, but by the date of his trial, he'd reversed himself completely. Since he passed a polygraph, it's clear that, at least at one point, Clausen was firm in the belief of his own guilt. Yet following his conviction in a court of law, he launched a successful appeal based on the grounds he'd knowingly made false statements during the trial. At his 1980 retrial, Clausen claimed he'd issued a false confession as a way of escaping charges levied against him in New Jersey. But once again, he was found guilty. Clausen continued to profess his innocence until his death in 2009 and received a degree of vindication when, in 2006, the investigation into Merritt and Karen's murders were reopened by the West Virginia State Police. Clausen was never fully exonerated for the murders, but if he didn't kill Merritt and Karen, who did? In December of 1970, William Bernard Hacker was arrested in Baltimore on suspicion of beheading a man named Herbert Coben. Following Coben's decapitation, Hacker drove his severed head into a rural area and then placed it under a flat rock near a creek. Born in 1896, Hacker's family had moved to West Virginia when he was still in grade school, and he'd briefly worked at Weirton Mine, less than a mile from where Merritt and Karen's bodies were found. Between the years 1921 and 1952, there were a series of unsolved decapitations in areas Hacker resided. He was eventually arrested and imprisoned for one such beheading in 1952, only to be released 14 years later in the year 1966. The same year Hacker was released, another unsolved beheading took place. Two similar crimes occurred the following year, with another taking place in 1969. It should also be noted that once Hacker was in prison for the murder of Herb Coben in 1970, the spate of mysterious decapitations suddenly ceased. Another name on the police list of potential suspects was John Brennan Crutchley. Crutchley's father worked for a company who owned the land where Merritt and Karen's bodies were found, and not only was Crutchley on school break in January of 1970, but his older sister was enrolled at WVU. Crutchley would later be convicted of kidnapping, violating and draining the blood of a 19-year-old Floridian girl named Laura Murphy, who would have died of blood loss within just a few short hours if she hadn't managed to escape Crutchley's clutches when she did. To this day, no concrete evidence ties Crutchley to Morgantown on the date of the murders, but he did have a reason to be there, and it's a deeply shocking one. Some have alleged that in early 1970, John Crutchley was conducting an intimate romantic relationship with his own sister. Since that relationship had to be kept secret, neither Crutchley nor his sister would announce or admit that a visit had taken place. But if one had, and Crutchley's sister decided to put an end to their unnatural affair, is it possible that a scorned and furious young psychopath would choose to direct his wrath to two helpless hitchhikers? Another suspect, in what became known as the WVU co-ed murders, was a man named Eddie Slaughter. Slaughter had worked as a janitor at WVU's Westchester Hall, the very same dorm Merritt and Karen had been staying in, but he had quit in early 1970 for undisclosed reasons. Then in early April, just a few weeks after the girls were murdered, a woman filed a report with the Morgantown police regarding a frightening encounter at a Westchester service station. She'd been waiting in line when a strange man began offering her a ride. The woman refused, but somehow was convinced to wait in the man's car until her friends arrived. The man proceeded to make her extremely uncomfortable, especially once he became fixated on her fur coat and hat. He claimed he liked to touch furry things, and then raised a hand towards her. The woman promptly fled from his car, then reported the interaction to police. But since it occurred prior to the discovery of Merritt and Karen's bodies, officers were unable to see the connection between the strange man's love of fur and the furry items of clothing missing from the two girls' bodies. Following the girls' disappearance, law enforcement tracked down the man's employer. Not only did they discover his name was Edward Slaughter, but Mr. Slaughter had called in sick on the morning of January 18th, the very same day Merritt and Karen went missing. In the hopes of connecting him to the Triangle murders, officers then visited Slaughter's place of residence to obtain a sample of his handwriting, but a comparison showed there were few similarities between Slaughter's handwriting and that which was present on the Triangle letters. This caused them to prematurely dismiss Slaughter as a suspect. Then, by the time they realized the letters had been written by the Psychic Science Church, the number of potential suspects were so vast that Slaughter was never revisited. Around the same time Slaughter was being reconsidered as a suspect, police once again appealed to the public for information. Shortly after, they received a call regarding a man named Ronnie Bird, a Morgantown resident with a reputation for lighting fires and hurting animals. Officers from the local police department decided to pay him a visit, and while Bird was initially cordial with them, he lost his temper when they asked what kind of car he was driving back in early 1970. The question had exposed a convenient gap in Bird's otherwise flawless recollection. Then, after becoming argumentative, he demanded the two officers vacate his residence. The two men complied, thanking him as they made their way towards the door. But on the way out, one of the officers glanced at a framed photograph hanging from Bird's wall, only to realize he recognized its subject. The man in the photograph was Eddie Slaughter, and Ronnie Bird was his nephew. Was Slaughter directly responsible for Merritt and Karen's disappearance, Or did his own flesh and blood bring them to him in the hopes of winning his approval? The aforementioned individuals constitute just a fraction of the complete list of suspects, and the sheer number of them made the search for the girl's killer much more difficult. Yet according to some, the investigation was even further hampered by West Virginia's own government. During April of 1971, a West Virginia state trooper named Preston B. Gooden claimed his employers at the Department of Public Safety had, and I quote, lied about department activity in reference to the murders of Merritt and Karen. Trooper Gooden also claimed he could provide documentary evidence that this was the case, adding that a representative of the state governor was interfering in the case for political reasons. One such example he gave was the case of Sergeant Robert L. Mazingo, who was transferred to a different regional office after insisting the wrong leads were being followed. Trooper Gooden also claimed that Sergeant Mazingo was quickly advancing an investigation into the car bombing of a vehicle owned by Monongalia County prosecutor Joseph Larita Jr. Mr. Larita had been conducting a vigorous campaign against gambling and vice in his home county when a professionally wired car bomb exploded in his own driveway. He underwent surgery to treat severe wounds to his right leg and right arm, and thankfully survived his injuries, but his right hand was rendered permanently disabled. Mr. Larita continued to practice law but declined to run for re-election. Trooper Gooden, on the other hand, was promptly dismissed as a West Virginia state trooper. 6 years later, Trooper Gooden sued the West Virginia Department of Public Safety on the grounds his dismissal violated his First Amendment rights. The court heard how Gooden had been charged with insubordination after alleging the department's promotional system was, and I quote, geared to who you hunt and fish with or who you know rather than on merit. Gooden also alleged there was, quote, a system that permits an officer to associate with known racketeers and still reach a rank of leadership, and that the department reflects a system that still has not learned that professional police work and politics do not mix. A judge later determined that Trooper Gooden's constitutional rights had indeed been violated, and it's believed that he was awarded a sizable settlement as a result. But perhaps the reason the state governor, Arch Alfred Moore, reacted so ruthlessly to accusations of corruption is because they were true. In 1990, and following an extensive federal investigation, Moore pleaded guilty to 5 felonies, including mail fraud, tax fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. Not only had he accepted illegal payments and extorted over $500,000 from the Maben Energy Corporation, he'd conspired to derail investigations into his own corruption. This may well have included the car bombing Sergeant Mazingo had been investigating, and quite possibly the murders of Merritt Malarick and Karen Farrell. Moore was punished with a $3.2 million fine and sentenced to just less than 6 years in prison. He ended up paying less than a quarter of his fine, and he served just 2 years before serving out the remaining 4 months of his vastly reduced sentence at his home in Glendale, West Virginia. As a result of his conviction, Moore was banned from practicing law in the state, and during the final years of his life, he fought vehemently to be reinstated. I followed the advice that I got, and it was not the right advice, he said, referring to his decision to cheat, lie, and steal from the people he purported to serve. Being a lawyer is something I always wanted to be. It's what I was, and what I am. Thankfully, Moore's attempts were unsuccessful, but any links he might have had to the murders of Merritt Malarick and Karen Farrell were never established. Paul Clausen might have died with a conviction hanging over him, but it's quite clear that he was not Merritt and Karen's murderer. Yet whether or not it was Hacker, Slaughter, Crutchley, or Bird who took their lives seems almost irrelevant at this point. The world will always be full of monsters, people who lure the innocent into malign traps, but we've already established popular systems by which they can be caught, captured, or even killed. The final 4 words of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance read, "And justice for all." Yet when charlatans don masks of virtue and corrupt those systems with the slow poison of self-service, there is justice for none. Because there is no fighting the monsters without, unless we first vanquish those within. Hey friends, thanks for listening. click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.